She had waited 3 years for him to say something real. Instead, Wyatt Boone leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, that crooked smirk cutting across his face like he owned the whole valley, which frankly he acted like he did, and said the words that should have ended everything. "At this rate, Clara, you'll never get married." He meant it as a joke. He always meant things as jokes when he didn't have the guts to mean them as the truth. But Clara Bennett didn't laugh. She didn't throw water in his face. She didn't even raise her voice. She just looked at him for one long, quiet moment, the kind of quiet that makes a man's stomach drop, and whispered something so soft he almost missed it. "Only if you ask me." Then she picked up her fence wire, walked back toward her property, and never looked back. And Wyatt Boone stood there in the cold Montana wind, holding a stupid joke in his mouth like a stone he'd already swallowed, realizing too late that he had just been handed everything he'd ever wanted and had nearly let it walk away forever. If this story moves you, if you've ever swallowed something true and called it a joke, subscribe to this channel and follow along. Every story we tell here goes somewhere real. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. Let's begin. The goat's name was Biscuit. Nobody asked for that detail, but it matters because Biscuit was the reason Wyatt Boone and Clara Bennett met, fought, and, though neither of them would have admitted it for 3 full years, fell quietly and stubbornly in love with each other in the most inconvenient way possible. It was a Tuesday in early April when Biscuit first appeared on Wyatt's property. Wyatt found the animal standing in the middle of his east pasture with the kind of unbothered confidence that, in his experience, belonged only to goats and men who had never once doubted themselves. The goat was chewing something. Wyatt squinted. It was chewing the corner of his fence repair schedule, a paper he'd left pinned to a post that morning. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, staring at the animal. The animal stared back. Wyatt had lived alone on the Boone Ranch for going on 6 years. He was not a man who startled easily, nor a man who raised his voice unless there was genuine cause. But something about the absolute calm in that goat's yellow eyes made the back of his neck prickle in a way he couldn't explain. It felt like being judged by something that had already made up its mind about you. "Off," he said. Biscuit chewed. Wyatt clapped his hands once, sharp, the way you do to startle a dog. Biscuit tilted his head exactly 3 degrees to the left and kept chewing. Wyatt took a breath, walked toward the animal slowly, and grabbed it by the collar, a fraying length of rope with a small handwritten tag that read, in careful block letters, "Biscuit, property of C. Bennett, Eastern Ridge." He knew the Eastern Ridge. He knew it because the homestead that sat on it had been empty for going on 4 years before somebody bought it last fall. He'd seen the lights come on over there in late October. He'd noted it the way a man notes weather, aware of it, cautious about what it might bring, not particularly interested in investigating further. He hadn't met his neighbor yet. Silver Creek was not a town where people rushed introductions. He found out that afternoon that his neighbor did not wait for introductions either. He'd barely tied Biscuit to his porch rail and walked back inside to pour himself a second cup of coffee when he heard boots on the porch steps. Quick steps. Purposeful steps. The kind that didn't slow down as they approached a strange door. 3 knocks. Hard. He opened the door. Clara Bennett was standing on his porch in mud-caked work boots, a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large for her, and the expression of someone who had already decided this conversation was going to go her way. She was not tall. She had dark hair pulled back in a knot that had clearly started the morning neat and had been losing that fight for several hours. There was a smear of something, clay, maybe, or axle grease, along her left jaw that she either didn't know about or didn't care about. Wyatt suspected the latter. "You have my goat," she said. Not hello, not excuse me, just that, delivered like a fact he'd been withholding. "He was in my east pasture eating my paperwork," Wyatt said. "He wanders." "I noticed. I'll fix the fence line this week." "That'd be good." She looked past him toward the porch rail where Biscuit stood, apparently now entirely content. She stepped around Wyatt without being invited in, not into the house, just past him on the porch. and untied the rope with a quick practice knot release that told him she'd done it approximately 1,000 times before. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said, not looking at him. "Eastern Ridge." "Wyatt Boone." "I know." She finally glanced back at him. "You've got the biggest spread in this part of the valley. Everybody knows the Boone Ranch." He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an opening argument. He'd learn over time that with Clara it was almost always both. "How long have you been on the ridge?" he asked. "Since October. You fixed the place up yourself?" "Mostly." She scratched Biscuit behind the ears and the goat practically melted. Traitor, Wyatt thought. "I had help with the roof. Everything else was mine." He nodded. He didn't know what else to say, which was an unusual problem for him. He generally had plenty to say. He'd been told, more than once and with varying degrees of affection, that he had too much to say. "I'll fix the fence," she said again. "He won't be back." "All right." She gave him one more look, the kind that takes your full measure without appearing to, and then walked back down the porch steps with the goat trotting beside her like a small, self-satisfied soldier. Wyatt watched her go. He went back inside and drank his coffee and told himself she seemed competent enough. That was all. Competent neighbor. Good. Kept to herself. Better. Biscuit was back in his east pasture 4 days later. This time, Wyatt didn't go to the trouble of tying the goat up. He walked the fence line between their properties himself, found the gap, a section of wire that had rusted through at the base, old damage that her repairs had missed because you couldn't see it from the surface, and fixed it himself in about 40 minutes. He didn't tell her. He didn't know why he didn't tell her. He just didn't. He found out she noticed anyway when she appeared at his fence line the next morning, standing on her side, looking at his repair work with an expression he couldn't read from 20 feet away. He was close enough to hear her say, quietly and mostly to herself, "Morning," he called. She looked up. "You fixed it. You missed a rusted section about 8 feet south of your post." "I would have found it." "Goat found it first." She pressed her mouth together. He could see she was deciding whether to thank him or resent the implication that she'd missed something. Watching that internal argument cross her face was, he would later acknowledge to absolutely no one, quietly fascinating. "Thank you," she said, like the words cost her something. "Don't mention it." She nodded once and walked back toward her barn. He watched her go again. He picked up his tools. He went back to work and did not think about it further. He thought about it approximately 4 more times before lunch. The first real argument happened 3 weeks later over creek access. Silver Creek, the actual creek, not the town, ran along the property boundary between their 2 homesteads, cutting through a shallow valley where the land dipped between their fences. The water rights in that part of Montana were a complicated thing, documented in deeds that went back decades and were written by men who clearly enjoyed being difficult. Both homesteads had legal access to the creek. The problem was that the best access point, the flat, rocky shelf where you could actually get equipment close enough to divert water during dry spells, sat at the exact center of the boundary line. In practice, this meant whoever got there first in a dry season had the advantage. It had been a dry spring. Wyatt arrived at the creek shelf at 6:45 in the morning with his irrigation pipe fittings and found Clara Bennett already there, already working, with a diversion setup that would redirect a solid third of the practical flow toward her property. He stood on the bank and looked at her setup for a long moment. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "That's going to pull my east field dry by August if we don't get rain. I need the water for the kitchen garden and the animal pens. My secondary well is running low." "My secondary well isn't running low yet, but it will be if you have 3 times the land I do." She looked up at him now, straight and direct. "You have 2 more wells than I have. You have municipal backup that I'm still waiting on the county to connect." Every one of those things was true. He hated that every one of those things was true. "I have 3 times the livestock," he said, "and 10 times the reserves. You don't know what my reserves look like. I know what a ranch this size costs to run, and I know what water pressure looks like on a shared creek line. I grew up on a homestead, Mr. Boone. I'm not guessing." He opened his mouth, closed it. She had done it again. The thing where she handed him a fact so precisely placed that arguing around it required more energy than was dignified. "Fine," he said. Take your third, but if my Eastfield shows stress by July, we renegotiate. Fair. And you let me know before you start working the line, not after. She tilted her head slightly. You let me know, too. He hadn't. He'd shown up without saying a word. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. Deal, he said. They didn't shake on it. They didn't need to. There was, Wyatt was beginning to realize, a particular kind of understanding that existed between two stubborn people who were both, at their core, fundamentally fair. It didn't look like warmth. It looked like two gunslingers agreeing on the rules before they drew. But it held. He went back that evening and rerouted two of his secondary irrigation lines so his draw on the creek would be lighter than she'd accounted for. He didn't tell her he'd done it. He never told her he'd done it. He found out, years later, that she'd known within a week. She'd measured the flow. Of course she had. What? By June, the town of Silver Creek had opinions. Small towns always do. It's not malicious, mostly. It's the natural result of a community where everyone's business exists in a shared space, where the feed store and the post office and the single diner on Main Street function as a kind of open-air information exchange that nobody technically runs but everyone contributes to. The information being exchanged that June was that the Bennett woman on the Eastern Ridge and Wyatt Boone were at each other constantly, and it was, depending on who you asked, either a disaster or the most entertaining thing to happen in Silver Creek since old Pete Calloway's escaped bull showed up at the Methodist Church social 3 summers ago. Martha Haynes at the feed store had a theory. Martha always had a theory. They're the same person, Martha told her Thursday regulars with the satisfaction of someone who has solved something. That's what it is. You put two people who are exactly the same in a room, and they either love each other or they can't stand it, sometimes both at once. Wyatt Boone and that woman are not the same person, said Dale Pruitt, who hadn't spoken to Wyatt about anything beyond cattle prices in 6 years and felt qualified to opine anyway. She fixed her own roof ridge, Martha said. He regraded his own access road last fall with a rented grader and no help. She argued the county assessor down 15% on her property evaluation. He argued the county assessor down 20% the year before. She keeps records of everything. He keeps records of everything. Martha paused. Last week she came in here and stood in that aisle for 6 minutes deciding between 2 grades of fence wire. So does Wyatt, someone said. I know, Martha said. Same 6 minutes, same aisle, same 2 grades. She spread her hands. Same person. None of this reached Wyatt or Clara directly. Small towns had a particular talent for discussing people at significant volume while somehow ensuring the people being discussed were the last to hear it. But Wyatt started noticing things. He noticed that when Clara drove into town on Saturdays, she made her stops in a specific order: feed store, post office, hardware, diner. That was, he realized slowly, almost identical to his own. He noticed that she read the same county agricultural bulletins he did. He noticed that when there was a bad storm warning and he went out to double-check his livestock shelters at 10 at night, he could see her barn light come on too. He didn't mention any of this. What would he have said? He noticed, that was all. The livestock disaster happened on a Friday in early August, and it was the first time Wyatt saw Clara Bennett genuinely scared. Not frightened of a thing scared. Scared the way you get scared when something you've built is in danger of being taken from you. The specific terror of watching your life's work threaten to come apart. Her fence on the north side had failed overnight. Not the section near his property, the far northern section that bordered a steeper terrain. And by morning, 6 of her goats and 3 of her sheep had wandered onto a rocky hillside where the terrain was dangerous and the footing was unpredictable. 2 of the goats were already on a ledge that required real effort to reach. Wyatt found out because he could hear her from his barn. Not screaming. Clara Bennett did not scream. But her voice, carrying across the morning air, had a tight-clipped quality he'd never heard before. She was on her phone, he realized, trying to reach someone, and whoever it was wasn't answering. He didn't think about it. He put down his tools, got his rope, and walked over. She looked at him when he climbed the fence to her side of the property line. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were steady. She held them steady by force of will. He could see the effort in her knuckles, but her eyes were doing something complicated. "The two on the ledge," she said. "I can get to one. The other ones, I see it." He'd already assessed the hillside. "Go for the lower one. I'll take the high position. The footing's bad up there." "I know." Wyatt, it was the first time she'd used his first name. He noted it without remarking on it. "I've got it, Clara. Go." They worked for 2 hours. It was not graceful work. He slipped twice on the upper approach and felt his knee take a hit against the rock that he knew he'd feel for a week. One of the goats, not Biscuit, a smaller gray one who apparently also had a death wish, bit him. Clara lost her footing on the lower ledge, caught herself, and said a word he hadn't heard a woman say in that particular combination in some years. By mid-morning, all 9 animals were back on flat ground. Clara sat down on a rock and put her hands on her knees and breathed for a moment. Just breathed. Wyatt stood nearby, feeling his knee throb, flexing his bitten hand. "Thank you," she said finally. "Fence line?" he asked. "Post failure. 3rd one on the north run. I noticed it was leaning last week and put it on the list. You need to work from the weakest point first, not the most convenient." She looked up at him. He wasn't sure if she was about to agree or argue. It was always 50-50 with Clara. "You're right," she said. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. "I know you're right," she added. "I do know that. I just had 6 other things ahead of it, and I miscalculated." She looked away. This was the consequence. There was something very honest about the way she said it. No deflection, no softening, no story around it. Just the clean acknowledgement of a misjudgment and what it had cost. He'd known plenty of people who couldn't do that. Men and women, both. People who could move mountains of pride before they'd simply say, "I misjudged." "We all miscalculate," he said. She nodded once. They fixed the fence post together that afternoon. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. He held posts. She drove them. She cut wire. He secured it. They moved around each other in the confined space of the fence line with the unconscious coordination of people who had been working alongside each other for years, not months. He thought about that on the drive back to his barn. He thought, when did that happen? He didn't have an answer. It had just happened, quietly, in the space between all the arguing and all the creek negotiations and all the morning fence checks. Somewhere in there, without any announcement, they had learned each other. He told himself it was the natural result of neighboring. People who shared a fence line learned each other's rhythms. It was practical. It was nothing to read into. He believed that, more or less, until the evening. Until he was sitting on his porch in the dark, listening to the quiet, and found himself thinking, not about the fence, not about the livestock, not about his bruised knee, but about the look on Clara Bennett's face when she'd sat on that rock and said, "I know you're right," without flinching. He sat with that thought for a long time. He went inside. He didn't know what to do with it, so he did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with. He filed it somewhere he didn't intend to look at again, and went to bed. The problem with things you file in places you don't intend to look at again is that they tend to stay exactly where you put them, waiting with all the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. And that is how Wyatt Boone spent the rest of that summer, competent, stubborn, independent, occasionally infuriating, slowly and helplessly failing at the project of not thinking about his neighbor. He didn't know yet that she was failing at the same project with equal determination. Nobody in Silver Creek was surprised. Nobody, that is, except the 2 people it was happening to. The fall came in hard that year, the way Montana fall tends to go. Not gradually, not with the polite warning of cooling nights and changing leaves, but all at once, like a door slammed shut on summer. One morning, the air was still warm enough to work without a jacket. 3 days later, the first frost hit the valley floor and didn't apologize for it. Wyatt noticed Clara's wood supply was short. He didn't go over and say anything about it. That wasn't the kind of thing you said to Clara Bennett, who would look at you with those level eyes and explain, calmly and precisely, that she was aware of her own wood supply and had a plan for it. Thank you. So instead he split an extra 2 cords during his own wood-cutting week and left a stack near the boundary fence with no note, no explanation, just wood, cut and stacked and left there. She didn't say anything for 4 days. On the 5th day he found a cloth-covered dish on his porch step. Cornbread, still faintly warm. No note. He stood there holding it for a moment, feeling something in his chest that he identified after careful consideration as being simultaneously pleased and deeply annoyed at how pleased he was. That was more or less the rhythm they'd settled into by October. Practical gestures, quiet acknowledgments, arguments about everything that mattered less. Fence angles, irrigation timing, whether the county road grader was doing its job on their shared access road, which it wasn't, and this strange, unspoken exchange of small kindnesses that neither of them ever named out loud. The town noticed. The town always noticed. What the town was noticing specifically, that fall, was that Wyatt Boone was driving past the Bennett Ridge on his way into town, even on days when the longer route would have been faster, and that Clara Bennett had started timing her Saturday errands within 20 minutes of his, which she had absolutely not done at the beginning of the year. People in Silver Creek were not romantic in the gossip magazine sense of the word. They were ranchers and farmers and tradespeople who understood that most of life was work and weather and bad luck and occasional good luck. But they were observant in the way that people who survive by reading conditions become observant. They saw patterns. Martha Haynes had upgraded her theory. She was now telling Thursday regulars that it was only a matter of time, which was the most confident position Martha ever took on anything, and Martha was rarely wrong. Wyatt and Clara, for their part, were doing their level best to remain entirely oblivious. This required considerable effort from both of them. It was in late October, a full year after Clara had first arrived on the Eastern Ridge, that the effort started showing real cracks. They'd both ended up at the hardware store on the same afternoon, a coincidence, though Wyatt would later admit privately to himself, at approximately 2 in the morning when the admission couldn't embarrass him, that he had possibly glanced out his window and seen her truck heading down the valley road and found a reason to go into town. He wasn't proud of it. It was the kind of thing a man told himself he wasn't doing even while he was doing it. They ran into each other in the lumber aisle. Clara was staring at a display of gate hardware with an expression of deep concentration, a small handwritten list in her hand, her lips moving slightly as she cross-referenced it with prices. "New gate or repair?" he asked. She didn't startle. She'd heard him coming the same way she always seemed to hear him coming, some attunement to his particular footstep that she would have denied to her last breath. "New. The east gate's post rotted at the base. I want to do it right this time rather than patch it again." "What's your post depth?" 30 inches. "Frost line here's about 24. "Go 36, he said. "I know what the frost line is supposed to be. We had an unusual freeze 4 years ago that went to 29. Wasn't common, but it happened." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because my gate post failed that winter, and I replaced it at 36 and it hasn't moved since." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the hardware. 36, she said, making a note on her list. Just like that. No argument, no qualification. He had relevant experience. She incorporated it. He'd learned this about her, that beneath the stubbornness was a core of genuine pragmatism. If the information was good, she used it. Pride didn't get in the way of practical. He respected that more than he'd ever said. "You need help setting the post?" he asked. He said it carefully, neutrally, the way you offer help in Montana, as a practical question, not a gesture, because in this part of the world there was a difference and people knew it. She considered the offer with the same seriousness she considered all her decisions. "Saturday morning," she said, "if you're not busy. I'll come by at 7. 8, she said. "I'm not fast in the mornings." He almost smiled. He'd seen her out at first light more than once. Clara Bennett was absolutely fast in the mornings. She just didn't want him to know that. He had no idea why, but the small, inexplicable contradiction of it stayed with him all the way home. They set the gate post on Saturday. It took the morning. They argued, mildly but with full commitment, about the exact positioning of the latch hardware, which was the kind of argument that sounds ridiculous from the outside, but from the inside is entirely about two people who both have strong spatial reasoning and are constitutionally unable to defer on matters of physical geometry. They landed, eventually, on her positioning, which was correct, which Wyatt acknowledged by installing it her way without comment, which was his way of conceding without conceding. She noticed. She let it go, which was her way of accepting the concession without making it worse. Afterward, she made coffee, and they sat on her porch. Not his porch, her porch, which was a different thing somehow, which Wyatt did not examine, and drank it without talking for a while. The valley spread out below them in the gray November light, the ranch land patchwork quilted across the bottom, the mountains holding their snow higher up. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. He looked at her. It wasn't the kind of question she usually asked. "No." "Never?" "No, you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it this summer, when the fence failed and the animals got onto the hill." She looked at her coffee. "I stood there for about 10 minutes before I called anyone, just thinking, maybe I bit off more than I can chew. Maybe this is the sign." He hadn't known that. He'd seen the aftermath, but not the 10 minutes before. "What stopped you?" "I don't know exactly." She paused. "I looked at what I'd already built. The barn repairs, the drainage fix on the north pasture, the kitchen garden, even the bad fence I should have fixed sooner." A short breath, almost a laugh. "I'd done all of it myself, every piece of it. And it felt like I can't leave something I built that hard, even when it's hard." Wyatt looked out at the valley for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly it." She glanced at him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There are things you say everything about by saying almost nothing, and this was one of them. This mutual recognition of the same bone-deep attachment to something you made with your own hands, in your own time, against every difficulty. It was, he would later think, the truest conversation they'd ever had, and it had taken about 45 words. He drove home in the thin winter light and told himself again that this was neighboring. This was what people in close proximity built over time. It didn't mean anything beyond that. He was getting worse at believing it. Winter in Silver Creek was its own kind of test every year. Not dramatic suffering, not the kind that made for good stories, but the grinding, daily, relentless demand of cold that didn't let up for months, pipes that needed watching, animals that needed extra feed and shelter, checks twice daily, equipment that needed to run in temperatures that equipment did not enjoy running in, roads that could turn dangerous in an hour. The kind of winter that didn't ask you how you were doing, just kept presenting its requirements and letting you discover whether you were equal to them. They checked on each other through it without establishing a formal system for checking on each other. He'd see her barn light. She'd see his truck. Text sent with the particular economy of people who are busy and cold. Creek access frozen solid on my side using north diversion. Understood. Same here. Generator ran low last night, back up now. Copy. Short, practical, frequent. If you squinted, you could read it as something else entirely. Wyatt made a point of not squinting. The real crack in winter came in January, during a hard freeze that turned the road into glare ice for 5 days straight. He got a call at 9 at night. Clara. She'd had a heifer go down. First-time mother, the calf was coming early, and she was having trouble, and the large animal vet was on another emergency 30 miles out and couldn't reach her for at least 2 hours. "How far along?" he asked. "Been pushing for 40 minutes. Something's not right with the presentation." "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The road? I'll be there in 10 minutes, Clara." He drove very carefully. He was there in 12 minutes, which felt like an eternity and was actually, given the road conditions, close to a miracle. He'd brought what he needed. He'd done this before, multiple times, on his own ranch, and there are skills that rural life burns into you whether you ask for them or not. What followed was an hour and a half of work that was difficult and messy and required both of them, in close quarters, in the cold, doing things that had nothing romantic about them and everything fundamental. Clara was calm through it. He'd expected that, but was still struck by it. The way she steadied herself, the way she listened when he explained what he was doing, the way she didn't get in the way or hover, but stayed present and useful at every step. The calf arrived at 11:15, small and wet and uncertain about the world, and the heifer was up within the hour. Clara sat back in the hay and let out a long, shaking breath. It was the first physical sign of the strain she'd been holding all evening, the first crack in the composure, just that one breath. "Thank you," she said. "You did most of it." I didn't know what to do with the presentation problem. Now you do. She nodded, looking at the calf who had found its legs in the tentative swaying way of all newborn things. There was something about her face in that moment, relief and exhaustion, and something quieter underneath both of those, that hit Wyatt in a place he'd been carefully defending for months. He looked away. He busied himself cleaning up, organizing, the small practical tasks of aftermath. "Stay," she said, "until you're warm enough to drive. The road's worse at this hour." "I'm fine." "Wyatt." Her voice was quiet but direct. "The road is ice and it's midnight. Sit down and drink something warm and leave in 20 minutes when you're not running on adrenaline." He sat down. She made coffee on the small camp stove she kept in the barn for exactly these kinds of nights. Because of course she did. Because Clara Bennett prepared for things. They sat in the hay in the half-light with the heifer and her calf and drank bad camp stove coffee and didn't say much. He was aware, sitting there, of how close they were in the small space. The kind of close that in any other context would have required an explanation or at least an acknowledgement. In a barn in a Montana January at midnight with bad coffee, it required neither. It just was. He left at 25 minutes, not 20. She didn't point that out. He drove home on the ice very carefully, thinking about her face when she'd let out that breath. The first unguarded moment he'd ever seen from her, the one she hadn't intended to let him see. He thought about it for 3 miles before he made himself stop. He admitted somewhere around the 4-mile mark, in serious trouble. Spring came the way it always did, arriving in pieces, taking back what it gave, then finally committing. By March, the creek was running high with snowmelt. By April, the mud season was in full, miserable effect, and the roads between their properties were a navigational challenge that built character, mostly through irritation. It was during mud season that the argument about the shared access road escalated to the level that Silver Creek actually took sides. The access road that connected both their properties to the county road was, technically, shared maintenance. The reality was that it had been maintained primarily by Wyatt for years before Clara arrived, because there had been no one else. When Clara arrived, she'd taken on the northern third without anyone asking her to. They'd never formalized this arrangement, which was fine until a particularly bad mud season exposed the fact that the middle section, the section neither of them had claimed, was deteriorating in ways that were going to make it impassable by July. The argument at its core was simple: who was responsible for the middle third? Wyatt's position was that historically, the whole road was his responsibility and he would handle it. Clara's position was that she was now here and contributed and should contribute to the middle section as well. These positions should not have been irreconcilable. They were, in fact, both variations of the same position, which was that both of them were prepared to take on more than their share. The problem was neither of them would let the other be the one to give in. They had the argument in stages, first outside the feed store, then by the fence line, then in a parking lot, while Dale Pruitt tried and failed to look like he wasn't listening from his truck, across 3 weeks of spring, with no resolution except mounting stubbornness on both sides. The town began to offer opinions. Martha Haynes suggested they just grade the whole road together on the same day, and whoever finished their half first could move to the middle. Dale Pruitt suggested they flip a coin, which was either simple wisdom or a profound misunderstanding of the people involved. No one was sure which. Old Carter Webb, who was 73 and had seen a great deal, sat at the diner counter and said nothing, but smiled in a way that suggested he found the whole situation highly informative. It resolved itself the way their arguments always eventually resolved, not by either of them backing down, but by external reality overriding the standoff. The middle section gave out entirely on a Thursday morning, and both their trucks were stuck on the wrong side of it by 9 a.m., and by 10 a.m. they were both there with equipment, working the same section from opposite ends, and by noon they'd met in the middle. They never agreed on whose responsibility it was. They both fixed it anyway, which, Wyatt thought, driving home over the newly graded road, was probably the most honest possible description of how they functioned. The newcomer arrived in May. His name was Daniel Marsh, and he was 35. And he had come to Silver Creek for reasons that were vague in the way that people with money and time are sometimes vague. Something about wanting space, maybe starting a small operation, possibly looking at property. He was tall, easy smiling, well-maintained in a way that suggested a previous life in a city. He bought coffee at the diner and charmed Martha Haynes in approximately 7 minutes, which was either a testament to his social skills or to Martha's fundamental good nature toward good-looking strangers. He met Clara at the post office. Wyatt heard about this from 3 separate people before he'd been in town 2 hours on a Saturday, which was a record even for Silver Creek. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself this clearly, specifically, in the truck, with the kind of internal firmness he usually reserved for financial decisions. Clara Bennett was his neighbor. She was not his anything. She had the same right as anyone to meet people at the post office. He believed this. He absolutely, fully believed this. He was also, for reasons he refused to examine, in a genuinely terrible mood for the rest of the day. Daniel Marsh was in Silver Creek for 3 weeks before he asked Clara if she'd like to have dinner at the diner. Wyatt knew about the dinner because Clara mentioned it, offhandedly, while they were both checking the creek access one morning. Mentioned it the way you mention a dentist appointment, as a fact about your upcoming schedule, not as information specifically being shared. "The Marsh guy," Wyatt said. "He asked me to dinner Thursday. You going?" I said yes. She looked at him. "Is that your business?" "No," he said immediately. "Okay then." He looked at the creek. She looked at the creek. The creek continued moving in the particular direction it always moved, unconcerned. "He doesn't know anything about running land," Wyatt said. "He's not running land. He's looking at property. He's from Seattle. So we're about 40% of the people in this valley at some point, including Jim Dorsey, who runs the most efficient operation in the county." She paused. "You're being unfair." "I'm being accurate." Those aren't the same thing. He didn't have a response to that. She was right, again, in that specific way she had of being right that made him feel like she'd removed a floorboard he hadn't known he was standing on. He went home and fixed a section of barn roof that didn't need fixing yet because he needed something to do with his hands and did not think about Clara having dinner with Daniel Marsh on Thursday, and did this so thoroughly and completely that by Wednesday he'd thought about it approximately every 4 hours and had achieved nothing except a very well-maintained barn roof. Thursday came. He did not drive past the diner. He had no reason to drive past the diner. He didn't drive past the diner. He found out the following Saturday from Martha, who was incapable of withholding information of social significance for more than a business week, that the dinner had gone well, that Daniel Marsh was very charming, and that he had asked Clara if she'd like to show him some of the trails in the eastern hills, which Clara had apparently agreed to. "Good for her," Wyatt said, in the tone of a man who means the opposite and is not performing it well. Martha looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been watching 2 people be idiots about each other for going on 14 months. She didn't say anything. She handed him his receipt and waited for the next customer. The trail's invitation meant Daniel Marsh was going to be on the eastern ridge, in Clara's territory, around her operation, seeing the things she'd built. Wyatt went through a full week of not caring about this and came out the other side no closer to actually not caring about it, which was new information about himself that he found profoundly unwelcome. He saw Daniel's truck at Clara's place on a Saturday afternoon in June. He was doing nothing in particular near his own fence line, fixing something minor. He wasn't watching. He just happened to notice the truck. And he happened to notice, about an hour later, Clara and Daniel standing near her barn with the comfortable, unhurried body language of people who were not in a hurry to end their afternoon. He went inside. He made dinner. He ate it. He sat on his porch in the evening and looked at the valley and conducted what was, if he was being honest with himself, a full audit of his own behavior over the past 14 months. He went through it methodically the way he went through everything, because Wyatt Boone was nothing if not thorough when he chose to be. What he found was not flattering. He had spent 14 months being Clara Bennett's neighbor, her opponent in every minor territorial dispute, her midnight emergency backup, her tacit provider of firewood she'd never asked for, her gatepost assistant, her calf delivery partner. And in all of that time, he had said exactly nothing that went beyond the immediate and practical. Not one word. Not one honest word about any of the things he'd been filing in that place he didn't intend to look. He'd called it neighboring. He'd called it practical. He'd called it obvious and therefore unnecessary to articulate. What it actually was, he sat on that porch and admitted to himself in the blue June evening, was fear. The plain, unglamorous, specific fear of a man who had managed very well on his own for a very long time and was not at all sure what happened to that management if he opened a door he couldn't close. He sat with that admission for a long time. The trouble with genuine self-knowledge is that once you have it, it's very difficult to pretend you don't. Wyatt Boone had just told himself the truth about himself, and the truth had opinions about what he was going to do next, and those opinions were getting louder by the evening. He still didn't do anything, not that night. He wasn't ready, and he knew it, and Wyatt had enough hard-earned respect for reality to not pretend readiness he didn't have. But something had shifted. Something that had been very carefully in one place was now somewhere else, and it didn't intend to move back. It was a joke that broke it open. Late June, a Thursday, the diner. Clara and Daniel Marsh had been seen having coffee twice more since the trail afternoon. Silver Creek was now divided on the question of whether something was developing there, with Martha in the affirmative camp and Dale Pruitt unconvinced, though Dale was unconvinced about most things as a matter of personal policy. Wyatt was at the counter, and Clara came in alone, and they ended up sitting near each other the way they always did in the diner, by the window, in the natural gravitational way that had stopped surprising anyone in Silver Creek, including themselves. They'd been talking about the County Road Board's latest budget decision, which was enraging in the specific way that County Road Board decisions always were. And somehow the conversation had moved, the way conversations between people who are comfortable with each other will move without formal transitions. From road budgets to the upcoming summer social at the community hall, to who from Silver Creek might or might not attend, to Wyatt, remarking that the summer social was traditionally where half the valley's marriages had started, a statistical claim he was making up but felt confident about. And then, because his mouth sometimes moved faster than his judgment, a flaw he knew about and had never fully corrected, he looked at Clara across the diner table and said, with the easy grin of someone making a joke because the alternative required courage he hadn't located yet, "At this rate, you'll never get married." He meant it as teasing. He meant it about the summer social, about her general disinterest in such events, about the way she navigated social occasions with the same purposeful efficiency with which she fixed fence posts. He meant it as the kind of joke that two people with history can make, the kind that bounces off rather than lands. It landed. Not like a blow, like a stone dropped into still water. He could see the ripple move across her face, something going still and then very clear in her eyes. And then Clara Bennett, who chose her words with the precision of someone who did not waste them, looked at him across the table and said, very quietly, "Only if you ask me." The diner continued its background noise. Plates, conversation, the bell on the door. None of it registered. Wyatt felt the full meaning of those words arrive in him the way cold water arrives, all at once, system-wide, undeniable. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make sure he'd heard it, long enough to make sure it wasn't a joke, wasn't deflection, wasn't the quick wit he'd come to expect from her as conversational armor. This was not armor. Then she looked down at her coffee, picked it up, took a sip, and when she looked back at him, her face was composed. "That bill for the road board survey is going to be ridiculous," she said. "You should fight it." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "The precedent they're setting on the drainage easement alone," she continued, "is going to cost everyone on the South Valley Road more money in 3 years than whatever they're saving now." "Clara," he started, "I should get back." She stood. She gathered her jacket from the chair back. She looked at him one more time, just briefly, but it was enough, that look. It carried everything she'd said and everything she wasn't saying, and the quiet verdict of a woman who had been patient with a specific kind of cowardice for 14 months and was now, gently and without cruelty, letting him know that her patience was not without limit. "See you around, Wyatt." She walked out of the diner. He sat at the counter for 3 full minutes without moving. When he finally picked up his coffee, his hand wasn't quite steady. He set it down again. He stared at the window where he could see her truck pulling out of the lot onto the main road. and he sat with the specific sensation of a man watching an opportunity move away from him while his feet remain, for reasons that no longer made any sense, completely still. Martha Haynes was suddenly busy with something behind the counter that required her full attention and was nonetheless happening approximately 4 feet from where Wyatt was sitting. He didn't look at her. He knew her expression already. He paid his bill. He walked out. He got in his truck and drove toward home and didn't turn the radio on because the radio would have been sound in a space that needed to be completely quiet while he figured out what happened next. What happened next was that he drove past the turnoff to his ranch. He drove past it, continued on the county road, and sat parked on the shoulder for a while with both hands on the wheel and the engine running. Only, if you ask me, 365 days of borrowing reasons to cross a fence line. 365 days of firewood and bad camp stove coffee and midnight calves and creek negotiations and arguments about road thirds that were never really about the road. 365 days of knowing and not saying, because saying it required stepping off a ledge that had no visible bottom. And Wyatt Boone was a man who liked to know where he was going to land before he moved. But she had been the brave one. She had said the thing clearly at the diner table in the plainest possible language, and then she had walked out and left him with it. Not with manipulation, not with games, just with the truth delivered and the choice handed to him and no indication of how long the choice would remain open. He started the truck. He didn't go home. He had some thinking to do and some courage to locate, and a woman on an eastern ridge who had told him the only thing that had ever mattered in the plainest possible words, and Wyatt Boone was stubborn enough about everything else in his life that he could not, in the end, live with being a coward about this one. The valley went long and gold in the evening light around him. He drove. He drove for 40 minutes before he turned around, not because he changed his mind, because he needed to think it through completely, the way he thought through every serious decision, not impulsively, not on the back of emotion alone, but with full understanding of what he was about to do and why, so that when he did it, he could stand behind it without flinching. He owed Clara that much. He owed her a man who showed up certain, not one who arrived half-assembled and hoping for the best. The problem was that the thinking kept circling back to the same place. He'd go through the practical arguments, the complications of neighbors becoming something more, the risk to a working relationship that functioned, the fact that he was not, by any honest accounting, an easy man to be around. And every time he reached the end of the argument, he found her face at the diner table waiting for him there. That quiet look. Those 3 words. Only if you ask me. She hadn't left the door open as an act of charity. Clara Bennett did not do charity. She'd left it open because she meant it, and because she'd decided that saying it once plainly was the most she was willing to do. The rest was his. He turned around at the North County Road junction and drove home. He went inside. He did not sleep well. This was, he recognized, entirely appropriate. In the morning, he made a list, not of reasons to go to her or reasons not to. He was past that. He made a practical list, the only kind he knew how to make, of what he was going to do and in what order. He looked at the list. He crossed off 2 items that were delay tactics dressed up as preparation. He went to the barn and loaded fence posts into the truck bed. 6 posts. A post driver. 2 coils of new wire. A bag of concrete mix. He knew the section of Clara's east fence that had been bothering her for 3 weeks. She'd mentioned it twice, once in passing, once while looking at it with the specific expression she had for problems she hadn't gotten to yet. He'd noted it. He'd noted it because he noted everything about her operation the way you note the weather, habitually because it mattered. He drove to her property. It was 7:45 in the morning. He wasn't early enough to seem desperate, and he wasn't late enough to seem considered. He was just there, at her fence line, pulling posts from his truck bed, because this was the only honest language he knew. Not flowers, not speeches, not the performed gestures of courtship that both of them would have found embarrassing. Just work. Just showing up and doing the thing that needed doing in the place where he was needed. He heard her boots on the gravel before he saw her. She stopped about 15 feet away. She looked at him. She looked at the posts. She looked at the wire. Her expression was unreadable in the particular way that Clara's expressions were unreadable when she was reading everything. "What are you doing?" she said. East fence, third and fourth posts are healing over. I brought 60-inch replacements. The soil's soft there from the spring melt, and you need the extra depth. He set a post against the truck and looked at her. I should have said something at the diner. She was quiet. I didn't, because I'm not good at that, saying things. He picked up the post driver. I'm better at this. Wyatt, I know it's not, he started. Put the post driver down. He put it down. She walked toward him, slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone making a decision at the same time as they're executing it. She stopped close enough that he could see she hadn't slept particularly well either, and that she'd come outside without finishing her coffee, which she never did, because the half-full mug was in her left hand. You drove 40 minutes north and came back, she said. He stared at her. How do you know that? Because you drove past my ridge road at 6:47 going north, and you came back at 7:22 going south, and I know how long that road is. She held his gaze. I wasn't tracking you. I was feeding animals. I have a line of sight to the county road from the barn. He exhaled slowly. Of course she did. Of course she'd clocked it, the way she clocked everything, the water pressure and the fence angles and the frost line depth and the exact passage of his truck on the road outside her property. I needed to think, he said. I know. She looked at him steadily. Did you finish? Yeah. And? He'd had a speech, briefly, on the drive over. He'd discarded it because it sounded like something from a television program, and Clara would have seen through it in approximately 4 seconds. What he had instead was the truth, which was less polished and probably more useful. I've been doing this wrong, he said, the whole time. I kept telling myself it was neighboring, that I was being practical, that all of it, the wood and the posts and the creek and the midnight calves, was just what people do for each other out here. He paused. It wasn't. It wasn't for me, anyway. I don't know exactly when it stopped being that, but it stopped a long time ago. She didn't fill the silence. That was one of the things about her. She didn't rush silences to make them more comfortable. She let them be what they were. I'm not easy, he said. You know that better than anyone. I'm stubborn, and I'm bad at saying things, and I have opinions about fence wire grades that are probably excessive. He saw something shift slightly in her expression, not quite a smile, but the infrastructure of one. I'm not offering you something simple. I know what you are, she said. I've known for about a year. Then you know more than I did for most of that year. She set her coffee mug on the truck's side rail with a small, precise movement. You want to ask me something? Yeah. Then ask me. He looked at her. This woman who had shown up on his porch arguing about a goat, who had navigated their first conversation like a border negotiation, who had sat in the hay at midnight drinking bad coffee without complaining, who had said, I know you're right without flinching, who had told him the most important thing she could have told him in a diner with 3 words, and then walked out and handed him the rest to carry. And he said, would you have dinner with me? Not at the diner. Somewhere that isn't the whole town watching. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't grand. It was a man at a fence line at 7:45 in the morning asking a plain question. Yes, she said in exactly the same register, plain and complete. Neither of them moved for a moment. You still want to fix the fence? She asked. That's why I brought the posts. I'll get my gloves. She went inside. He picked up the post driver. He heard, very faintly from inside the house, the sound that might have been, he wasn't certain, and he would never ask, her laughing. He found himself grinning at a fence post like an absolute fool, and did not particularly care. They fixed the fence. It took most of the morning. They argued about the concrete mix ratio, settled on hers, which was correct, moved along the fence line in the comfortable non-silence of people who had been working alongside each other long enough not to need continuous conversation, and finished by 11:30 with 4 new posts solid enough to outlast both of them. She made lunch. He didn't leave until 2 in the afternoon. They sat at her kitchen table with sandwiches and talked about the county water board and a heifer he was planning to sell and the book she was reading, which was about frontier land management in the 1880s, which he borrowed when he left. It was the most ordinary afternoon in the world, and he drove home feeling like something that had been wound tight in him for over a year had finally, quietly, been released. He asked her to dinner on a Wednesday. They drove to a restaurant in the next town over. Millhaven, 20 miles south, nice enough but not precious. The kind of place where you could get a good steak and the lighting didn't require anyone to perform. They talked for 3 hours. He learned that she had grown up in Central Oregon, not Montana, that her father had run a small sheep operation and that she'd helped from age 6, that she'd done 2 years of agricultural college before deciding she'd learn more from doing than from classrooms, that she had one sister in Portland who thought she was mildly insane for buying frontier property alone, and that she had been in one serious relationship before moving to Silver Creek, which had ended not catastrophically, but in the gradual, inevitable way of two people who wanted different things, and had taken too long to admit it. He told her about his own history, the Boone Ranch that had been his father's and his father's father's, that he'd inherited at 26 when his father passed, that he'd almost sold at 28 when the weight of it came closest to exceeding what he was capable of, that he'd stayed because of exactly what Clara had described. He couldn't leave something he'd fought that hard to keep. He told her about the one woman he'd almost married at 30, a fact he hadn't told many people, and how she'd left for Portland. Portland, he noted with a dry look, seemed to be where people went when Silver Creek didn't suit them, and how he'd subsequently been too busy or too wary, or if he was being accurate, too scared to revisit that particular territory. Clara listened to all of it the way she listened to everything, completely, without performing interest, without interjecting to redirect it toward herself. It was one of her qualities that was easy to overlook because it didn't announce itself. This genuine attention she paid to what you were actually saying, not to what she was planning to say next. "You were scared," she said when he finished, not as a judgment, but as a simple acknowledgement of a stated fact. "Yeah." "Of what specifically? Losing the ranch or losing the person? I couldn't figure out how to protect both." She considered that. "You'd have to decide which one you'd burn to save the other." Something like that. "What's your answer now?" He looked at her across the restaurant table. "I think I've been giving you firewood and midnight fence calls for a year, because some part of me already knew." She held his gaze. "That's the most romantic thing you've said to me, and it involves firewood and fence calls. I told you I wasn't good at this." "You're better than you think." He wasn't sure that was true, but he appreciated that she said it without softening it into false comfort. She said it like an assessment, and Clara's assessments were things you could rely on. They drove home through the dark valley with the mountains outlined against a sky thick with stars, and he walked her to her door, and there was a moment on the porch that was simple and brief and sufficient, and he drove home with both hands steady on the wheel. The town of Silver Creek's response to the news was, in fairness, not news. It was confirmation. Martha Haynes did not say "I told you so" directly, but communicated it through the medium of a warm expression and a very significant pause in conversation whenever the topic arose, which was roughly equivalent. Dale Pruitt said he'd seen it coming for months, which was revisionist history of the most cheerful kind. Old Carter Webb at the diner counter nodded once when he heard, with the expression of a man whose theory had been proven, and went back to his coffee. Daniel Marsh had, in fact, already left Silver Creek by the time any of this became public knowledge. He'd looked at 2 properties, made no offers, found the winters described to him by locals to be more than he'd bargained for in his imagination, and returned to Seattle, which was apparently where most things that weren't built for Montana eventually returned to. Clara mentioned this without ceremony. Wyatt received the information without ceremony. Neither of them discussed it further, because there was nothing to discuss. It had been a handful of dinners and a trail walk. It had been Clara keeping her options open in the honest way of a woman who had not been given sufficient reason to keep them closed. And it was over. What was not over was the adjustment period. Wyatt had not been wrong when he said he wasn't easy. He was, in the privacy of a closer relationship, even more specifically himself than he'd been as a neighbor, which, Clara would later say, she should have anticipated but somehow hadn't fully. He had opinions about kitchen organization that he expressed unprompted. He was incapable of leaving a problem half-solved, which meant that when he was at her place, he often noticed something that needed fixing and fixed it without asking, which she found simultaneously thoughtful and maddening because it rearranged her mental list without her consent. He He went quiet when he was processing something difficult, for periods that would have read as withdrawal to someone who didn't understand that it was just his system working through the problem. And Clara had to learn, not without some friction, that the quiet was not distance. She, for her part, was not easy either. She made decisions without consulting him about things that had come to affect both of them, not because she was inconsiderate, but because she had operated alone for so long that the habit of solo decision-making was deeply grooved. He'd find out she'd spoken to the county assessor about the road easement without mentioning it, or that she'd scheduled a vet visit for a shared livestock concern without telling him first. She defended her choices with precision and expected him to argue back at full strength, which he did, which she found satisfying, which he found baffling until he understood that the argument was her version of trust. She only fought with full force with people she respected, and she expected the same. They found this out about each other over the course of the summer and early fall. The second fall, Clara's second on the ridge, not through crisis but through the accumulation of ordinary friction, the small collisions of two established people learning to share space without losing themselves in the sharing. There was one argument in September that was not small. It started about the road, specifically about a proposal Wyatt had made to the county that would formalize the maintenance arrangement on the shared access road, which was sensible and which Clara agreed with in principle. The problem was that he'd submitted the proposal before telling her, which meant her name appeared on documentation she hadn't reviewed, which meant the county had called her about details she wasn't prepared to discuss, which meant she'd had to call him in the middle of a workday to ask him what he'd submitted in her name. "I didn't submit anything in your name," he said. "I submitted a joint maintenance proposal. Your property is part of the joint." "You submitted it without telling me first." "I told you about it 2 weeks ago." "You mentioned it. There's a difference between mentioning something and telling me you're going to file paperwork." He went quiet for a beat, which she had learned by now was not silence. It was the sound of him deciding how to respond rather than reacting. "You're right that I should have told you before I filed it." "Yes. But the proposal itself is sound." "I know the proposal is sound. That's not the point." Her voice was controlled, but only just. "Wyatt, I left a place where someone made decisions that involved me without asking me. I'm not doing that again. Not here. Not with you." That landed differently. He heard what was under it. Not the road proposal, not the paperwork, but the thing she'd just told him about herself, the thing behind the boundary she was drawing. He hadn't known, specifically, what had ended her previous relationship. He knew now. "I won't do it again," he said. "I need that to be a real commitment, not an apology." "It's both." She was quiet on her end. "Clara," he said it carefully, "I'm sorry for the specific thing I did and for what it made you feel. Both." Another pause. "All right. The county called you about the drainage clause?" "The drainage clause in the maintenance schedule." "Do you want to go over the full filing together?" "Yes, tonight." "I'll come at 6. "Bring food." "I'm not cooking after dealing with the county." He brought food. They went through the filing together, line by line, at her kitchen table, and she had 3 legitimate improvements to the language that he incorporated, and they resubmitted it jointly the following morning. The revised version was better than his original. He didn't say that. She knew he thought it. Neither of them needed the words. But the conversation about her previous relationship sat with him. He didn't press her on it. He was not a presser, and she was not a person who responded to pressing. But he held it, the way you hold something you've been given that you know has weight. She told him something real, under the argument, something that wasn't about the road at all. He was aware that she told him, and that she knew she told him, and that there was a kind of trust in the telling that he did not intend to misplace. The marriage question arrived in November on a cold morning in the most undramatic way possible. They were at his kitchen table this time. She'd taken to coming over for coffee 2 or 3 mornings a week on her way to early chores, or he'd go to her place, and the distinction of whose kitchen it was had started to matter less over the months. They were going over the winter feed inventory, a project that required both their estimates because they'd started coordinating supply purchases to get better bulk pricing, which had begun as a financial decision and had become, without either of them formally noting it, a fairly complete integration of their operational planning. He looked at the inventory sheet. He looked at her, bent over her own copy, making notes in the margins in the small, precise handwriting she had. "We should probably just get married," he said. He said it the way he'd said it about the fence post depth, as a practical observation that followed logically from the evidence. She didn't look up immediately. She made one more note. Then she capped her pen and looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that required her fullest attention. "Is that a question?" she said. He held her gaze. "Yes." "Then ask it like one." He put down his paper. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had fixed her own roof and argued with county assessors and sat in midnight hay with bad coffee and told him the truth in a diner and expected him to be equal to it, and he said, "Clara Bennett, I would like to marry you. Will you marry me?" No ring, no candles, no kneeling, because the floor was cold and the gesture would have made them both uncomfortable. Just the question, plain and real and fully meant. She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." "Obviously," he repeated. "You've been working up to that for about 3 months. It wasn't subtle." "I wasn't aware I was working up to it for 3 months." "I know." She picked her pen back up. "That's what made it not subtle." She looked at the inventory sheet. "We're short on alfalfa. We need to order before the December price increase." He looked at her. She was making another note in the margin, perfectly composed, and there was something in the set of her shoulders, something quietly, entirely happy, that was not composure at all, and that she wasn't hiding especially well, and that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "All right," he said. "I'll call the supplier. Order for both properties. We'll split the bill. We're getting married. We don't have to split everything down the middle. We do until we're actually married. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." He laughed. Really laughed. The kind that comes without warning. And she looked up, and for a moment they were both just laughing at the kitchen table over a feed inventory sheet, and it was the best he'd felt in longer than he could account for. The town of Silver Creek's response to the engagement was largely Martha Haynes saying obviously in approximately 30 separate conversations over the following 2 weeks, with minor variations of emphasis depending on her audience. A sympathy card for the town's collective patience was not sent, but the sentiment was implied. The wedding itself happened the following April. Simple and practical, the way they did everything. They were married by a county judge who had known Wyatt's family for 20 years in the community hall with the valley's working population in attendance, which meant everyone wore the cleanest version of their work clothes, and the food afterward was contributed by approximately 40 different households, and the whole thing lasted 4 hours, because these were people who had livestock to get back to. Clara wore her mother's silver earrings and a dress she'd ordered from a catalog in Millhaven that she'd described to her sister in Portland as suitable, which her sister had taken as insufficient and she had taken as accurate. She looked, Wyatt thought, watching her walk toward him across the community hall. Not down an aisle, just across a room, which was more true to who they both were. Exactly like herself. Not transformed by the occasion, just her, in her mother's earrings, making another deliberate decision. He thought about the first time he'd opened his door and found her on his porch arguing about a goat. The distance between that moment and this one was not what he would have predicted. It was not smooth. It was not the way stories describe these progressions. Not a clear arc, not a sequence of obvious milestones. It was fence posts and creek disputes and bad coffee at midnight and one sentence in a diner and 40 minutes of driving north before turning around. It was the long, slow, irregular education of two stubborn people in the difficult subject of trusting another person with the parts of yourself you'd learned to protect. She reached him. She looked at him with those level, honest eyes. "You're nervous," she said quietly, because she noticed everything. "A little," he admitted. "Don't be." She said it plainly, the way she said everything. Not as reassurance exactly, more as information. "Don't be, because I'm certain, because this is the right thing, because I know what I'm doing." He believed her. The judge began, and outside the community hall windows, the April valley was green from the snowmelt, and the mountains held their white a little longer, and the two properties on the eastern ridge sat side by side in the afternoon light, with the fence line between them that they'd argued about, and repaired and negotiated over for 2 full years before either of them had said the honest thing out loud. After, at the reception, Martha Haynes hugged Clara with genuine warmth and told her she'd known from the feed store aisle. Clara accepted this claim with equanimity, which was generous, since she'd known herself before the feed store aisle and had simply been waiting for Wyatt to catch up. Old Carter Webb shook Wyatt's hand at the end of the evening. He didn't say much. He rarely did. He just held the handshake for a moment longer than a regular handshake and nodded once, the way he had at the diner counter months ago, with the expression of a man who has seen how these things tend to go and is satisfied when they go right. "Good," Carter said. "Yeah," Wyatt said. Biscuit, tied to a post outside the community hall because Clara had refused to leave him home on a significant occasion, had eaten a corner of the welcome banner sometime during the reception. Nobody had noticed until it was too late. This was, everyone agreed, entirely on brand. They drove home through the April night, the 2 ranches dark and quiet ahead of them, and when they came to the junction where the road split toward his property one way and hers another, Wyatt kept straight toward her place, and she didn't remark on it. They sat on her porch for a while in the dark, listening to the valley settle into night, not talking, not needing to. The same comfortable quiet they'd had on that porch the previous November with their coffee, except that something had been resolved in the space between that quiet and this one, all the unfinished business of 2 people who had been circling the true thing for a long time had been laid down. "We're going to argue about combining the operations," Clara said eventually. "I know. I'm not giving up independent title on my parcel. I wouldn't ask you to." She turned to look at him. "You were thinking about asking?" He had been. He let the silence confirm it. "We'll work it out," she said. "We always do." Across the valley, somewhere in the dark, an animal called Once, one of her goats, probably Biscuit recovering from the banner, and then went quiet. The mountains stood in their old, indifferent patience at the edges of everything. Wyatt Boone sat on his wife's porch in the Montana night and understood, in the specific and unglamorous way he understood most true things, that the hardest part of his life was also going to be the best part of it, and that those 2 things were not in opposition, and that he had found this out by being stubbornly, helplessly, entirely himself, and being met at every step by someone equally herself. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. They argued about the operations merger for 6 weeks. Not continuously. They had work to do, animals to feed, a Montana summer making its usual demands. But it ran underneath everything else like a current you could feel even when the surface was calm. Wyatt wanted to consolidate the grazing rotations and the feed purchasing under one ledger, which was efficient and made sound financial sense. Clara agreed with the efficiency argument and disagreed with the single ledger, because a single ledger meant a single decision-maker in practice, even when the theory said otherwise, and she had not spent 3 years building an independent operation to hand its accounting to someone else's system, even someone she'd married 4 weeks ago. "It's not someone else's system," Wyatt said. "It's our system. It's a system you designed before I had any input on it. Because I've been running it for 6 years. You've been running yours for 3. Experience matters. Experience in your operation, not mine. My operation has different constraints. Your operation is now part of the same operation. Legally, some of it is. Operationally, no." He looked at her. "Clara, we're married." "I'm aware." She said it without heat, just fact. "We're also 2 people with different ranching philosophies who happen to be married. Those aren't the same conversation." They landed eventually on a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely and both of them adequately, which Wyatt had come to understand was the truest definition of a working compromise. They kept separate operational ledgers with a shared capital account for joint purchases and infrastructure. Monthly reconciliation meetings, which sounded formal and which were in practice held at whoever's kitchen table had better coffee that week, gave them both visibility into the full picture without surrendering individual control. It was Martha Haynes who observed, when she heard the general outline of this arrangement from Clara at the feed store, that it sounded like exactly how 2 ranchers would structure a business partnership. Clara said yes, that was more or less the point. Martha said she'd thought marriage was supposed to be a romantic union. Clara said it was both, and the romantic union was what made her willing to sit through the monthly reconciliation meetings without walking out, so the two things were not unrelated. Martha told this story at the feed store counter for about 3 years. The first summer of marriage was not what either of them had imagined, which was appropriate since neither of them had spent much time imagining it. What they'd each imagined, independently and without discussion, was something like an extension of what had already been working. The good parts of proximity, the accumulated ease, the partnership that had already shown it could weather friction. What they got instead was all of that plus the particular pressure of two people who had each lived alone for significant stretches of their adult lives, now sharing not just land and logistics but the interior space of a life, which is a different and considerably more demanding adjustment. Wyatt had a system for everything. Not a rigid system. He was not rigid exactly, but a preferred sequence for how things should go, developed over 6 years of solo operation and deeply worn into his habits. Coffee before anything else. The barn check before breakfast. Equipment maintained on a schedule, not when something broke. Problems addressed in order of urgency, not in order of proximity or feeling. He had never particularly noticed these systems because there had been no one to notice them against. Clara noticed them within the first 2 weeks. "You reorganized the supply shelf," she said one morning, not as an accusation, just as an observation that came with a particular weight behind it. The labeling system made more sense the other way. I had a labeling system. It wasn't alphabetical. It was by frequency of use. The things I need every day were at the front. He looked at the shelf. He looked at her. He could see with hindsight that she was right. His reorganization was logical in the abstract and slightly less practical in the actual day-to-day of her operation. "I'll put it back." "I already put it back." She looked at him with the level gaze. "Wyatt, this is my barn. It's our It is legally, yes. In practice, it's my barn. I'm in it 6 times a day. You're in it maybe twice. When you make changes in here without asking me, it costs me time, and it costs me the mental load of putting it back." She paused. "I'm not angry. I'm telling you so you know." "Noted," he said, because he meant it. "Thank you." He stopped reorganizing her barn. It was harder than it should have been because the compulsion to order things was instinctive and not always conscious. But he caught himself twice more that month and redirected it toward his own buildings, which were, he would acknowledge, already well organized and did not require further attention. She, for her part, worked on the solo decision problem with what he could see was genuine effort and what she would have described as profound inconvenience. The habit of deciding alone ran so deep that she sometimes didn't register she was doing it until after the fact. He'd find out she'd changed the breeding schedule on her herd without mentioning it, or rescheduled a vet visit that affected when equipment was available to both of them. And she'd explain her reasoning, which was always sound, and he'd listen and say nothing wrong about the reasoning and then say that the issue was the process, and she'd nod. And a week later, the same pattern would surface from a different angle. "I know I do this," she said one evening at his kitchen table after a particularly circular version of the conversation. "I'm not doing it to exclude you. It's just the way I think. I solve the problem. I don't always think about who else the problem is adjacent to until after I've solved it. I know that. Does it help, knowing I'm not doing it deliberately?" He thought about it honestly. "A little. The impact's the same either way. But yeah, a little." She pressed her mouth together in a way that meant she was accepting something she found uncomfortable. "What do you need?" "A heads up. Before, not after. Even just, hey, I'm thinking about changing the breeding schedule. Does that hit anything on your end?" "Just that." "I can do that." "Can you, though?" "Because we've had this conversation. 3 times, I know." She looked at him directly. "I can do it. It's going to take me a while to build the habit, but I can do it. I'm telling you, I will." When Clara Bennett said she would do something with that particular directness, she did it. It took 3 months of visible, deliberate effort. He could sometimes see her catch herself mid-decision, stop, and send him a text. But the habit shifted. Not perfectly, not permanently, but substantially enough that it stopped being a friction point and became just one of the ongoing adjustments of shared life. These were not the great dramas of marriage. They were the small ones, which were in many ways more demanding because they required constant low-level attention rather than the clean mobilization of crisis. Wyatt and Clara were both excellent at crisis. They'd proven that multiple times before they'd ever said an honest word to each other. It was the ordinary, persistent work of accommodation that cost them more, because neither of them was built for accommodation as a default state. They were both built for independence, and independence does not naturally share shelf space. But they did the work. That was the thing. They both showed up to the work of it, stubbornly and imperfectly, and without quitting. The first real crisis of their marriage came 14 months in the form of a cattle market collapse that hit the valley like a slow-moving flood. Visible from a distance, survivable if you were positioned right, devastating if you weren't. Beef prices had been softening for 2 seasons. Most of the ranchers in the Silver Creek Valley had been watching the numbers and adjusting, or trying to. Wyatt had been conservative with his expansion plans, which meant his debt load was manageable when the bottom fell out. Clara's operation was smaller and more diversified. Goats, sheep, some cattle, the kitchen garden that had grown into a small commercial vegetable operation supplying 2 restaurants in Millhaven, which meant she was cushioned differently, not without exposure, but not on the sharp edge either. The ranchers who were in trouble were the ones who'd taken on significant debt to expand their cattle operations in the previous 2 years on the expectation of continued strong prices. 3 of them were on the South Valley Road. One of them was Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt, who had never particularly said anything warm to either of them, who had offered opinions about the Bennett Boone situation without invitation for 3 years, who was a decent enough man in the particular way of men who don't say much right but also don't say much wrong. Dale Pruitt came to Wyatt in October with his hat in his hands, which was not an expression with Dale Pruitt, who actually held his hat in his hands when he was in a difficult position and told him he was going to lose the North Pasture if he couldn't secure a short-term operating loan and the bank had said no. Wyatt heard him out. He didn't interrupt. He asked 3 questions: what the note amount was, what the duration was, and what the collateral situation looked like. Dale answered all 3 with the bare, uncomfortable honesty of a man who was past the point of presentation. Wyatt told him he'd talk to Clara and come back to him in 2 days. "You need to talk to your wife about it?" Dale said. Not dismissively. Genuinely puzzled, in the way of a man from a generation that had a specific model for how marital finances operated. "She's my partner," Wyatt said. "Yeah." He told Clara that evening. All of it. The numbers, the situation, his instinct, what he thought they could and couldn't do. She listened the way she always listened. She asked 2 questions that were better than his 3 had been, because she went straight to the structural issue he'd circled around. Then she was quiet for a moment. "What's your read on him?" she said. "Not the numbers. Him." "He'll pay it back," Wyatt said. "He's not a man who walks away from a debt. That's the one thing I'm sure of." "Then we help him." "It's not nothing. If he defaults—" "I know what it is." She met his eyes. "He's a neighbor. We help him." He felt something in that moment that he hadn't expected. Not surprise exactly, since he'd known for a long time that underneath Clara's precision and independence was a bedrock of genuine commitment to the people around her. But hearing it said that directly, that simply, when the dollars were real and the risk was real, confirmed something about who she was that he was glad to have confirmed. They made the loan to Dale Pruitt. They drew up a simple, clear repayment structure. Not because they didn't trust him, but because clear documentation protects relationships better than goodwill alone, which was something Clara insisted on and which Dale accepted without offense. Wyatt suspected Dale respected it, actually. A man who didn't like ambiguity in his own dealings could appreciate the absence of ambiguity in someone else's. Dale paid it back in full, 14 months later, 3 months ahead of schedule. He came to the house, not the barn, and he knocked and he handed Wyatt an envelope with the last payment and said quietly, "I won't forget this." Wyatt said, "You'd have done the same." Dale looked at him for a moment. "I'd have tried," he said, which was probably the most honest thing Dale Pruitt had ever said to him, and Wyatt appreciated it precisely for that. The cattle market eventually recovered, the way markets do. Slowly, incompletely, never quite back to where it had been. 2 of the 3 struggling South Valley operations survived. One didn't, and the family sold and left the valley by the following spring. That loss sat with the community in the quiet, specific way that any departure from a small place sits. Not with grief exactly, but with the sober awareness that the valley was finite and not everyone could hold on to their piece of it. The children arrived the way children arrive, urgently, and with the complete revision of all previously held assumptions about what daily life was going to look like. Their daughter, Ellie, came first, born in the second year of marriage in February. Claire had worked until 10 days before the due date, which her doctor in Millhaven called inadvisable, and Clara called a matter of operational necessity, and which Wyatt had negotiated down from 14 days before the due date through a process that had required more energy than renegotiating the creek access, which remained the benchmark for difficult conversations between them. Parenthood did to both of them what it does to people who are competent and independent. It introduced a category of situation in which competence and independence were insufficient. Ellie was colicky for the first 3 months, which meant no one slept, which meant the careful systems they'd built for managing 2 operations while managing a relationship were operating on a reserve tank they didn't know had a bottom until they found it. Wyatt discovered he was good with her in the middle of the night. He didn't know this about himself until it was required of him. The walking the floor at 2 a.m., the particular patience of staying upright and moving and calm when every part of his body wanted to be horizontal. He wasn't performing patience. He'd sit in the barn sometimes, Ellie in his arm, just walking the length of it in the dark, talking quietly about whatever was in his head. Feed prices, fence schedules, the argument he and Clara had tabled because they were both too tired to finish it. And Ellie would eventually quiet, not because of what he said, but because of the steadiness of the voice saying it. Clara, who had expected to be the capable one in this particular department, based on approximately nothing except in general assumption about herself, found the first months genuinely hard in a way she hadn't predicted and didn't entirely know how to hold. She was tired in a way that went past physical. She was not herself in ways that were difficult to locate. Not depressed, nothing clinical, just the profound displacement of becoming someone's mother when you had spent years being only yourself. She didn't talk about it easily. She talked about operational things, logistics, the feeding schedule, the adjustment to the work routine. The deeper things she held close for longer than was good for her. It was Martha Haynes, of all people, who got it out of her. Martha had stopped by with food, the Valley's universal language of care, and had sat at Clara's kitchen table while Ellie slept, and had said, in the direct Martha way, "How are you actually doing? Not the ranch. You." Clara had looked at her for a moment. "I don't know who I am right now," she said. And then, because it was Martha, and because Martha had a quality of receiving hard truths that made them easier to give, she told her the rest of it. The loss of herself she felt, the guilt about feeling lost when she had this healthy child and this good marriage and this operation she'd built, the exhaustion that made the guilt worse. Martha listened. She didn't fix it. She didn't minimize it or amplify it. She said, "That's real. What you're describing is real, and it doesn't mean anything is wrong with you. It means you're adjusting to something that requires you to become someone slightly different than who you were." "I don't want to be someone different." "You won't be different. You'll be more." Martha picked up her coffee. "Give yourself time. You're 3 months in. Nobody has this figured out at 3 months. Clara came home that night and told Wyatt what she'd said to Martha. Not all of it. Some of it was Martha's to hold, but enough. He listened. He didn't try to solve it. He'd learned over 2 years of marriage that her telling him something was not always an invitation to fix it, and that the discipline of listening without reaching for a solution was one he'd had to build from scratch, because it did not come naturally to him. He said, "Thank you for telling me." She leaned against him in the kitchen, her forehead to his shoulder, which was not a gesture she made often, and which he recognized as the weight it carried. He put his arm around her and didn't say anything else, and they stood there for a while in the kitchen with the baby monitor on the counter and the valley dark outside the windows. It got better. Not overnight. Over months, in the incremental way that genuine recovery moves, not a line but a general direction. By the time their son James arrived 2 years later, they had a system. It was imperfect and required constant renegotiation and had approximately 4 exceptions for every rule. But it held. The expansion decision nearly broke them. Not their marriage, they would both say later, with the clarity of people who had been close enough to the edge to see where it was, that their marriage was never in real danger. What was nearly broken was their working partnership, which was the architecture inside the marriage, the thing that made the day-to-day possible. It started with an opportunity. 340 acres on the north end of the valley, adjoining their properties, going to auction. Good land, well-watered, the kind of acreage that added to an operation didn't just expand it, but changed the category it operated in. From a good-sized family ranch to something that could anchor a legacy, carry the next generation, survive the bad years that inevitably came in agriculture because they always came. Wyatt wanted it. He wanted it with the particular intensity of a man who could see exactly what it made possible and had the experience to know that land like that didn't come available twice. Clara wanted it too, and also didn't want it, and couldn't reconcile those two positions fast enough for the auction timeline, which was pressing. "We don't have the capital without significant debt," she said. "The land pays for itself over 15 years at current yield. That's a projection, not a guarantee. All agriculture runs on projections. You know that. I know that. I also know what our debt ceiling is, and I know that land payment plus operating costs in a bad year puts us in a position I'm not comfortable with." She had the numbers. She always had the numbers. "Show me where I'm wrong." He went through it with her. He wasn't wrong about the yield projections. They were sound, based on the soil surveys and water access and comparable operations in the region. She wasn't wrong about the debt exposure. Both things were true simultaneously, which was the actual problem. "So we take on a partner," he said. She looked at him. "Who?" "Carter Webb's son has been looking to expand. He doesn't want the operational headache of running it himself, but he'd come in as a capital partner for a share of the yield." She was quiet for a moment. "You've already talked to him." "I scouted the idea. I didn't commit anything." "You should have told me before scouting." He held her gaze. "You're right. I should have." She accepted the acknowledgement without dwelling on it, because they'd gotten better at that, at giving and receiving accountability without turning it into a longer conversation than it needed to be. What are the terms he'd consider? They spent the next 4 evenings at the kitchen table going through it. Wyatt's land knowledge, Clara's financial precision, the penciled and repenciled numbers that covered 2 legal pads and were supplemented by 3 calls to an agricultural loan officer in Millhaven who had worked with Wyatt before and whom Clara interrogated with a thoroughness the man would later describe as the most productive financial conversation of his professional year. They bid on the land. They got it. The day the auction closed, they were both quiet on the drive home, sitting with the size of what they'd just done. 340 acres. The debt was real. The yield projections were sound. Neither of those things prevented the other from also being true. "We might regret this," Clara said. "We might. Oh, if we hit 2 bad years back to back, I know. I need to know you know. Not that you're optimistic, that you know." He looked at her. "I know what the bad version looks like. I've run the numbers on the bad version. I'm still in." She nodded. She looked out the window at the valley sliding past. "Me too," she said. "I'm still in." They didn't hit 2 bad years back to back. They hit 1 bad year, the 3rd year after the acquisition, when a drought cut yields and a late frost killed a portion of the expanded herd, and the repair costs on the north pasture infrastructure came in 40% over estimate. They spent that year in the particular grimness of people managing something serious with limited margin, making cuts that hurt, making calls that were uncomfortable, having conversations with their loan officer that required them to sit very still and think very clearly when every instinct said to move and react. Clara took on additional consulting work that year, advising 2 smaller operations on diversification strategies, work she could do in the margins of her own day mostly, but that added hours she didn't have and took from sleep and from the family evenings that had become the fixed point of their week. Wyatt cut his own salary to minimum operating draw for 8 months. They told each other the truth about the numbers every Sunday evening at the kitchen table, and did not pretend it was other than what it was. Ellie was 6 that year. James was 4. They understood in the vague way of children that things were tight and that their parents were tired. Ellie, who had Clara's quality of observation in a 6-year-old's unfiltered form, told her father one evening while he was putting her to bed that he had worried eyes. "I know, Bug," he said. "Is the ranch going to be okay?" He looked at her. He'd decided early on in the half-formed way you decide things about parenting before you've had enough experience to know if the decision holds, that he wasn't going to lie to his children about hard things. He wasn't going to burden them either. But the clean lie, the everything's fine, he couldn't do that. "We're working on a hard problem," he said. "Your mom and I are working on it together, and we're good at that, okay?" Ellie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all information. "You fix hard things," she said, not as a question. "We try. You fixed the heifer that time when I was little. That was your mom, mostly. You helped." "I helped," he agreed. She seemed satisfied with this. She went to sleep. He sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while before he went back downstairs to the kitchen table and the numbers and his wife. The ranch came through, not easily and not without permanent marks. There were decisions made that year that they'd look back on as necessary and not entirely painless. A particular relationship with a buyer they didn't repair, an equipment replacement they deferred too long. But they came through with the land intact and the debt restructured and the operation, by the following spring, beginning to breathe again in the way that things breathe when the crisis has passed and the ordinary work of living resumes. The Sunday evenings at the kitchen table remained, not for crisis management anymore, for the habit of it, which had become its own thing, a weekly check-in that was partly operational and partly the couple's version of how they kept each other informed about the interior state of things. What was working, what wasn't, what one of them was carrying that the other hadn't noticed yet. It wasn't romantic in any conventional sense. It was, in the specific way of two people who had chosen practicality as their love language from the beginning, deeply intimate. "James's teacher wants to talk to us," Clara said one Sunday, in his 7th year. "She says he needs more challenge, or he's going to start making his own." Wyatt looked up from the ledger. "What kind of challenge?" "Academic. He's ahead of the class on most things." She paused. "He also apparently reorganized the classroom supply shelf last week, without being asked." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Clara was looking at him with the expression she had when she was waiting for him to make a connection. "He reorganized the shelf," Wyatt repeated, "by some kind of internal logic that made sense to him and no one else." A very long pause. "I see," Wyatt said. "Do you?" "I'm saying I see." "I know what you're saying." She picked up her pen. "We'll go talk to the teacher, and you're going to have a conversation with your son about not reorganizing things that belong to other people. That conversation might require some self-awareness on my part." "It will, yes." She made a note. "You have some. Use it." He did. The conversation with James, age 7, about the supply shelf was one of the more unexpectedly illuminating parenting moments of Wyatt's life. Not because he solved it, but because he recognized it, in the complete and helpless way you recognize something that belongs to you. James had his father's systems and his mother's reasoning and a particular disregard for the gap between my solution and the right solution that suggested, Wyatt thought, a long and character-building road ahead for whoever had to live and work alongside him. He told Clara this that evening. She said she'd been watching the trajectory for about 2 years and had some thoughts on it. He asked her to share. She said it was going to require him to hear some things without becoming defensive. He said he'd try. She said try harder than that. He said fine. She told him. He listened. He was defensive for about 4 minutes and then set the defensiveness down because she was right, and because setting it down and using the information was what you did when someone who knew you told you the truth. This was more or less a Tuesday. This was more or less every Tuesday. And the valley outside held the seasons in their turn, and the north pasture that had terrified them delivered on its yield projections in the years that followed, and the 2 properties that had once been separated by a disputed fence line were now a single operation that the County Agricultural Extension Office would eventually use as a case study in efficient diversified ranching, which Clara found gratifying and Wyatt found slightly embarrassing, and both of them would have traded the recognition in an instant for one less difficult year, given the choice. But they didn't get to choose the difficult years. Nobody does. What they got to choose was what they brought to them and who they brought with them, and whether the person next to them at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening was someone they could tell the truth to without reservation. On that last point, both of them had chosen correctly. Neither of them had any doubt about that, even when everything else was in question. The porch had been repaired 3 times over the years. The original boards had gone soft in the second decade, and Wyatt had replaced them one summer afternoon while Clara sat in the doorway telling him which ones he'd missed, which was most of them, which he knew, which was why he'd started at the far end and worked toward her so she could see the progress without being able to stop him from finishing. The second repair was after a winter that took the railing on the east side. The third was James, at 15, who had backed the small tractor into the corner support post in a way that he maintained for years was partially the fault of the post placement, an argument that had not improved with age. But the porch was there. It had always come back. And on a September evening in the 31st year of their marriage, Wyatt and Clara Boone sat on it in the 2 chairs that had replaced 3 previous pairs over the decades, looking out at a valley that looked mostly the same as it had always looked, and was in fact entirely different because everything that had happened in it had changed what it meant. Wyatt was 64. Clara was 60. He had a bad knee, the one he'd taken against the rock on her hillside in the first year they'd known each other, which had never entirely forgiven him. And she had reading glasses that she refused to wear in public and wore constantly at home, and claimed not to be wearing when he mentioned them, which was a running piece of absurdity that had never once resolved and which he suspected never would. The ranch was, by any honest measure, successful. The north pasture that had terrified them in the 3rd year had become the core of their expanded grazing operation. The diversified model Clara had always pushed for: cattle, sheep, a smaller goat herd since Biscuit's descendants had proven more manageable than Biscuit himself, meant they'd weathered 3 more significant market disruptions over the decades without the cliff-edge experience of that first bad year. The vegetable operation had grown, then contracted when the Millhaven restaurants changed ownership, then grown again when Ellie, who had come back to the valley after agricultural college, had taken it over and expanded it into a direct sale model that served a larger regional market. Ellie ran the east section of the operation now. She was 30, with her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness, and the particular combination of both that made her simultaneously the most effective and most exhausting person in any room she occupied, which Clara found deeply satisfying and Wyatt found quietly hilarious. James was 28 and in his 3rd year of a graduate program in agricultural economics in Bozeman, which he'd chosen because he was genuinely interested in it, and which Wyatt suspected was also, in some part, because James needed the distance of a different city to figure out who he was when he wasn't on the land that had formed him. Wyatt understood that. He didn't say so. Some understandings were better expressed by not interfering with the process. James called on Sundays. The calls were long and specific. He had opinions about water rights policy and regional market structures and the consolidation of agricultural land in the West that were sharp and well-argued and occasionally directed at his parents' decisions in ways that required Wyatt to practice the same discipline of listening without defending that he'd been building for 30 years. Clara received these challenges with more equanimity than he did, which she found amusing, and which he found, if he was honest, mildly competitive. "He gets it from you," Wyatt told her once, after a particularly spirited Sunday call. "The economic analysis? The certainty that he's right." She considered this. "He usually is right. That's not the point. It's a little bit the point." He'd let that go, because letting things go was something he'd gotten better at over 30 years of practicing it daily, and also because she wasn't wrong, and also because their son's certainty, even when it was directed at them, was built on a foundation they'd laid, and there was something in that which was more satisfying than irritating, if he let himself sit with it. The valley was quieter than it had been. The 2 ranches that had been struggling on the South Road in the year of the cattle market collapse were now both under different ownership, one consolidated into a larger corporate operation that the community felt ambiguously about, one run by a young couple from Wyoming who had been welcomed the way Silver Creek welcomed newcomers, which was watchfully and with judgment reserved until judgment was warranted. Martha Haynes had retired from the feed store 7 years ago, and her daughter ran it now with the same quality of attentive interest in the valley's social landscape, which suggested the gift was heritable. Old Carter Webb had died at 89, in his own house, reportedly at his own kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him, which everyone who knew him felt was appropriate. Dale Pruitt had sold his operation at 72 to his nephew and moved to Billings, where his daughter lived. He'd come by before he left and stood in the Boone yard in the particular way of a man conducting a kind of accounting, and he'd said to Wyatt and Clara, with the blunt economy of a man who did not have practice with sentiment but was attempting it anyway, "You two are good neighbors. I mean that to cover the whole thing." Wyatt had shaken his hand. Clara had hugged him, which surprised Dale visibly, and which she did anyway, because she'd earned the right to decide when to surprise people. But the crisis that came in the 29th year was not external. It was Wyatt's heart. Not a failure, not the catastrophic kind, not the kind that took everything away in an instant, the kind that announces itself through pressure and fatigue, and a morning in February when he sat down on the barn floor and knew, with the bodily certainty of someone who had never before doubted his own machine, that something was wrong. He drove himself to the clinic in Mill Haven, which Clara never entirely forgave him for, the driving himself alone rather than calling her first. And the clinic sent him to the hospital in Billings, and the hospital kept him for 4 days and found a blockage that required a procedure and a new understanding of what his days needed to look like going forward. Clara arrived at the hospital in Billings 4 hours after he did. She'd found out from the Mill Haven clinic when she'd called looking for him. She'd driven the 120 miles alone, in the particular controlled way she managed things that terrified her. And when she'd walked into his room and seen him there, instrumented, diminished by the context of a hospital bed in a way he'd never looked before, she had sat down in the chair next to him and taken his hand and held it and not said anything for a full minute. "I should have called you," he said. "Yes. I didn't want to scare you until I knew what it was. I know why you didn't call me." She looked at him. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were doing something else. "It was the wrong decision. I know. You don't get to protect me from things that are happening to you. That's not what we are." "No," he said. "You're right." She held his hand and looked at the window, and he could see her working through something. Not anger. He knew her anger. This wasn't it. Something more fundamental. The recalibration that happens when you've glimpsed a world you're not ready for and have to fold it back into the ordinary world and keep going. "Wyatt," she said finally. "Yeah. Don't do that again." "I won't. I need that to be a real commitment, not an apology." He recognized the words. She recognized that he recognized them. 30 years collapsed into the distance between that diner table and this hospital room, and the echo of it between them was not sad. It was the opposite of sad. It was the specific warmth of two people who have built enough shared history that their own past can reach them in the present and mean something new. "It's both," he said. Same words, same register. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand once, firmly, and let it go and picked up the folder the doctor had left with his discharge instructions, because Clara Bennett Boone's version of sitting with emotion was to find the next practical thing that needed doing and do it, which he had known for 30 years and which still, occasionally, made him want to laugh with something that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. The recognition of someone so fully themselves that even in a hospital room in February, they were exactly who they'd always been. The recovery was 4 months of reduced activity that cost him more psychologically than physically. He was not a man who sat still well. He had never been a man who sat still well, and 62 years of moving through the world at the pace of a person who always had something that needed doing had not improved his capacity for stillness. Clara managed his recovery with the same methodical precision she brought to everything: the medication schedule, the dietary changes, the graduated return to physical work, and she did it without making him feel managed, which was a specific skill he acknowledged to her directly and which she accepted without false modesty. Ellie came back from her own place on the east section more often that spring. James called more. They both thought they were being subtle about the increased presence. They were not, but Wyatt received it for what it was and did not make it awkward by pointing out that he could see exactly what they were doing. By summer, he was back to full work, or close enough that the gap didn't cost the operation. The knee was worse. It was always worse after a period of reduced movement, which was one of the body's more spiteful design choices. And the dietary changes were a permanent negotiation between what his heart required and what his preferences had been for 60 years. But he was there. He was in the barn at first light. He was on the porch in the evening. He was, as he told Clara one morning with the particular matter-of-factness they both used for things that carried more weight than the tone suggested, very glad to still be here. "Good," she said, not looking up from the quarterly accounts. "I'd have been furious. At me? At the situation. I'd have been furious at the situation for decades, and it would have been very unpleasant for everyone around me." She turned a page. "So your continued existence is considerate of you." He looked at her bent over the accounts, the reading glasses she wasn't wearing perched on her nose, her hair entirely silver now in a way she'd never bothered to address because she had, in her words, better things to spend money and time on. And he thought about the woman on his porch in the mud-caked boots arguing about a goat, and the distance between that and this, and how the distance was not what he would have called it in the abstract. Not a journey, not a passage, not any of the words that make time sound deliberate and scenic. It was just time, filled with actual things, and here they were on the other side of most of it. "Clara," he said, I'm glad you fixed that fence wrong the first time." She looked up. The reading glasses caught the morning light. "I didn't fix it wrong. I missed a section. Biscuit found it. Biscuit was a destructive animal with no respect for property boundaries. Biscuit was the best thing that ever happened to me." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to say the real thing or the deflecting thing, the choice that had once been a longer pause and had gotten shorter over 30 years. "He was a terrible goat," she said. "But yes, the general vicinity of him worked out." He smiled. She went back to the accounts. Outside, the valley was doing what the valley did in September. The particular gold of late summer grass on the hills, the creek line visible through the willows, the mountains blue and clear in the distance. The morning had that quality of stillness before the day's work started, which was his favorite time, which had been his favorite time long before he'd had someone to share it with, and was better for the sharing in a way he had not predicted and could not have adequately described. Ellie brought her partner to dinner for the first time in October. His name was Reed. He'd grown up in eastern Montana. He ran a small equipment repair operation out of Mill Haven, and he had the quality, immediately apparent to both Wyatt and Clara for different reasons, of being genuinely at ease with silence, which in this family was a survival trait. Dinner was ordinary and not ordinary. Clara had made the kind of meal she made when she was making an effort without wanting it to look like an effort. Good food presented without ceremony, the table set practically, no candles, which Wyatt had learned early was Clara's firm line between a meal and a performance. Reed helped clear plates without being asked, which Clara noted and did not comment on, which was her version of high approval. Afterward, Wyatt and Reed ended up on the porch while Clara and Ellie stayed at the kitchen table in the extended conversation they had when they'd been apart for more than 2 weeks, which covered everything from the operation to the accounts to whatever Ellie was carrying that she hadn't said on the phone. Wyatt had learned not to interrupt that conversation. It was its own system, and it worked, and the right response to systems that worked was to leave them alone. Reed stood at the porch rail looking at the valley in the dark. He'd been quiet for a comfortable few minutes. "It's good land," he said. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "Ellie talks about it like it's, I don't know, not just property." "It isn't," Wyatt said. "It's the thing we built. When you build something over long enough, it stops being separate from you." Reed nodded slowly. "She said you two almost didn't end up together." Wyatt considered the statement. "That's one way to tell it. What's another way?" He looked at the dark valley for a moment. The creek was invisible but audible from the porch, the faint sound of moving water that he'd been hearing from this spot for 35 years. "We ended up together because we were both too stubborn to do the easy wrong thing, and neither of us could figure out how to do the hard right thing for about 1.5 years. He paused. "Eventually, the situation ran out of patience with us." Reed smiled. "The goat." Wyatt looked at him. "She told you about Biscuit." She said a goat started it. Biscuit started it. He leaned on the railing. I maintain the goat was the most consequential animal in the history of this valley. Clara disagrees, but she's wrong. Reed was quiet for a moment. She said you two still argue. Constantly. About everything? About everything worth arguing about, which is most things, if you're paying attention. He looked at the younger man. The arguing's not the problem. The problem is when you stop and call it peace. Reed absorbed this. He had the quality of someone who heard things and held them rather than immediately processing them out loud, which Wyatt respected. What's the actual hard part, he said. Long term. What's harder than you expected? Wyatt thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, because it was a real question, and Reed was asking it genuinely, and the least useful thing he could do was give a performed answer about love and commitment that didn't carry any actual information. Staying yourself, he said, while also genuinely letting the other person change you. Those two things pull in opposite directions, and you don't get to stop managing the tension. You just get better at it. He paused. And you have to keep choosing the person, not just once. Every time the choice comes up, every hard year, every disagreement that goes somewhere uncomfortable, every moment you could build a wall and choose not to. He looked at the dark hills. It's not romantic, it's more like farming. You don't farm once and then have a farm. You show up every day. Reed was quiet for a long moment. That's the most useful thing anyone's told me about this. Don't tell Clara I was philosophical. She'll say I'm getting soft. Are you? Wyatt thought about February, the hospital room, her hand on his, the words that had been true 30 years ago and truer now. Probably, he said. Don't tell her. The screen door opened and Ellie came out, followed by Clara with 2 mugs of coffee. Clara handed one to Wyatt without asking if he wanted it, 31 years of not asking, of just knowing, and stood beside him at the rail and looked at the same dark valley he'd been looking at. What were you talking about? Ellie asked. Farming, Wyatt said. Clara glanced at him sideways with the reading glasses pushed up on her head where they always ended up. He didn't look at her, but he felt the glance. Felt it the way he felt most of her, with the full-body attunement of someone who had spent 30 years learning one person with complete attention. He's being philosophical, she said. I said don't tell her, Wyatt said to Reed. Reed looked from one to the other with the expression of someone who has just watched a piece of information confirm itself. Ellie leaned against the rail and looked at her parents with an expression that was fond and exasperated and proprietary all at once. The look of a child who has been watching 2 people be exactly themselves for her entire life and has the full complicated feeling about it that you'd expect. You 2 are impossible, she said. We prefer consistent, Clara said. You're impossible consistently, Ellie said. Reed, you see what I grew up with. I see it, Reed said, and the way he said it suggested he found it more useful than impossible, which was either good judgment or the early optimism of someone who hadn't been in this family long enough yet, and only time would determine which. The last conversation of the evening happened after Ellie and Reed had driven back down the valley road, after the dishes were done in the way they'd done them for decades. Clara washing, Wyatt drying, a division of labor that had never been formally established and had never been renegotiated because it worked. And they both knew that working things deserved to be left alone. After the lights were off in the kitchen and the barn check was done, still, after all these years, both of them, because neither had ever been willing to be the one who didn't check, which meant both of them checked, which was redundant and also completely accurate to who they were. They sat on the porch. September night, cold enough now for jackets, the stars dense above the valley, in the way they got when the tourist season was over and the dust of summer had settled and the air was clear all the way to whatever was beyond the mountains. He's good, Clara said, about Reed. Yeah, he is. She picked well. She's got good judgment. He paused. Except for that equipment supplier she used 2 years ago. That was my recommendation, actually. A beat. I know. I was giving you an out. I don't need outs. I need accurate information. You recommended a bad supplier. And I corrected it. She pulled her jacket tighter. That's how it works. He looked at the stars for a while. She sat beside him in the particular way she'd always sat, not leaning, not tucked against him, just present beside him, her own person in her own space, adjacent and complete. They'd never been the kind of couple who needed to be touching constantly. They'd been, instead, the kind of couple who noticed the exact quality of the other person's silence and could read it without asking. It was a different kind of closeness. He would have said, if anyone had asked, which people didn't, usually, because the question required a degree of intimacy most people didn't extend to older couples who seemed settled, that it was the better kind. But he had nothing to compare it to. He'd only done this once. "I told Reed that we show up every day," he said. "Like farming." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate." He said it was the most useful thing anyone told him. "It's the most useful thing anyone told you?" He thought about it. "Martha Haynes told me early on that you and I were the same person." Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She wasn't wrong." "She was a little wrong. We're not the same person." "No, but we have the same, what's the word? The same load-bearing structure." He looked at her. "That's either very romantic or very architectural. With us, there's not much difference." She looked at the mountains. "I think that's what she meant. Not that we're identical, that we're made of similar material. You can build with that." He thought about the fence posts he'd brought to her that morning 32 years ago. The 6 posts and the wire and the concrete mix and the question buried in all of it that he hadn't known how to ask any other way. He thought about her standing in the yard looking at the truck bed, looking at him, already understanding what the post meant before he'd said anything, because she always understood the underneath of things, because she was made of the same material, because it turned out you could say the most important things without words if the other person knew how to read the language you actually spoke. "I should have come sooner," he said. "That morning, with the posts." She looked at him. It was a thing they hadn't talked about directly in all the years since, not because it was a wound, but because it had resolved, and resolved things didn't require reopening. But the night was that kind of night, the late September kind where the year is turning and something in the air invites honesty without urgency. "You came when you were ready," she said. "I could have been ready sooner." "Maybe, but you weren't." She held his gaze with those eyes that had never once let him hide from himself. "And I said what I said at the diner when I was ready. Not before." She paused. "We were both late. We got here." He held that. The simplicity of it, which was not dismissiveness. Clara was never dismissive about real things, but the clean acceptance of what had happened as what had happened, without revision or regret. She'd always been better at that than him. He'd gotten better at it from watching her for 30 years. That was one of the things you didn't expect about a long partnership, that you'd keep learning from the same person, that the lessons wouldn't stop, that someone who had been teaching you by example since the day they walked onto your porch arguing about a goat would still, in the 31st year, be showing you something about how to carry yourself. "We got here," he agreed. The valley was dark and quiet below them. The creek moved in its invisible way. Somewhere on the east section, a light was still on. Ellie's barn, probably, doing a late check on something, because Ellie Boone did not leave things unchecked, which was either her father's influence or her mother's, or the simple result of growing up in a household where showing up was the only philosophy anyone had ever explicitly endorsed. Wyatt looked at the light on the eastern ridge and thought about the first time he'd seen lights on over there, in October of the year before any of this had happened, when he'd noted it the way you note weather, with wariness and no particular expectation. He thought about how wrong he'd been to have no particular expectation. He thought about everything that a single light on a dark ridge had turned out to contain. "The goat started it," he said. "The goat started it," Clara agreed. A long, comfortable silence. "I miss that goat," she said quietly, which was something she had never once said in 30 years, and which was therefore coming now, in the dark of this specific night, more than it appeared to be. It was the whole thing said sideways. The beginning, the argument, the coffee in the barn, the words in the diner, the posts, the ringless proposal over a feed inventory, the bad year, the hospital room, the 31 years of showing up. All of it folded into a small, ridiculous sentence about a goat she'd spent his entire life on record calling a terrible animal. He didn't make it bigger than it was. He knew better. "I know," he said. And they sat on the porch that had been repaired 3 times and would probably need a 4th, on a ranch that had been built by stubbornness and honesty, and the specific refusal of two particular people to be anything other than exactly themselves, in a valley that held them the way valleys hold everything, without preference, without promise, with the plain indifferent permanence of land that was there before them and would be there after, and in which they had nonetheless managed, against all reasonable expectation, to make something that would outlast them both. Not because it was perfect, because they showed up every day, like farming,